morning, Year 9. So we are going to move on to a new unit when you return into the academy. Obviously, this is your last online learning lesson before I get to see you all tomorrow. So our next unit of work is the Love and Relationships Poetry Anthology. So today I'm just going to spend a little bit of time kind of telling you where that fits into the exam, how we're looking at the moment in terms of what we've covered so far, what else we're going to do with Anne in Spectacles, because obviously we're not just going to leave it there. But the first thing I really want to know is, what do you already know about poetry, and when was the last time you studied any sort of poetry in the academy? So hopefully you've had to think about your past experiences of poetry and you can remember when you last studied it in the academy. So basically poetry is a type of literature, okay? It's a text type. There's obviously many different types of poetry, many different styles of poetry, many different topics of poetry. And we're not going to get to cover them all, obviously. So our cluster is called Love and Relationships, and that's what the poems are focused on. So they're focused on romantic relationships, but they're also focused on relationships within families, within friendship groups as well. And then when was the last time you studied poetry? Obviously, because of COVID, your Year 8 scheme of learning didn't quite run to plan. So you should have done a multicultural poetry unit, which I'm not sure if you all did or not. But basically that would have obviously given you a little bit of an insight into poetry, but if not, don't worry. And there was also a war poetry unit in Year 7 when you guys were in Year 7. Again, if you've not done it, don't worry about it. Poetry is something that we can quite easily brush up on. So when you first come back into the academy, our first lesson will be around brushing up on poetry and how to analyse poetry. So obviously, as we discussed at the beginning of this year, we are now starting your GCSE content. So Anne in Spectacles was the first text that you were studying for the English literature exam. So for English, you sit 2 exams. You sit your English literature exam and you sit your English language exam. Now, English language we don't start to touch on until Year 10, so you've not got to worry about that. But obviously, English literature we like to start in Year 9 with you guys. So I'm just going to walk you through how the exam looks for English literature. So within English literature, you sit 2 actual exams, okay? So the first one you sit is paper 1. And the whole exam lasts 1 hour and 45 minutes. And the exam is split into section A and section B. So section A is an essay on Macbeth. There are 30 marks available for it and 4 marks available for the spike. You should spend about 45 minutes writing this. And then for section B, it's an essay on A Christmas Carol. There are 30 marks available and you should spend 45 minutes writing it. Now, obviously, those mathematicians out there will know that an hour and 45 minutes, if you add 2 45 minutes together, that doesn't include that. But it also allows for some time for you to plan and obviously to read the questions through. Now, obviously, Macbeth and A Christmas Carol might be texts you've never heard of before, or you may have heard of them. But they're really enjoyable texts to study, and we'll be studying those in Year 10. So for the moment, you don't need to worry about paper 1 because obviously we're not covering that content. However, what we are doing is covering paper 2 content. So paper 2, the exam lasts 2 hours and 15 minutes, so slightly longer than paper 1. The exam is split into section A, section B and section C. So there's 3 sections on this one rather than 2, hence why you've got a little bit longer to attempt them. So section A is an essay on Anne in Spectacles. So again, there are 30 marks available for the essay, 4 marks for spag, and you should spend about 45 minutes writing it. Now, obviously, we have started having a look at Anne in Spectacles. You've done some work on the plot and characters. That isn't everything that we need to do on Anne in Spectacles. That is a basic introduction to what the text is about. And that's why I've put such a focus on revision of the plot of what is happening, because you need to understand what is happening for us then to move on to the next step of GCSE, which is the analysing side, okay? So, even though we've already done Anne in Spectacles, we are going to come back to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to split this poetry unit in half. So we will study half of it running up to Easter and just a little bit after Easter. Then we're going to come back to Anne in Spectacles and do the quotations that you would need and the essay writing side of it. And then we'll come back to poetry at the end of the year. So we're breaking it up because we know that these units, have quite a lot of content and they're quite kind of difficult to get your head around. So if we keep coming back to them, then that's going to help you to remember. So this section B then is what we are going to focus on now. So this is an essay comparing 2 poems from the anthology. An anthology just basically means a book of a collection of poems, okay? So there are 30 marks available for the essay and you have 45 minutes to write it. So this is what we will be focusing on for our next unit of work. And then there is also a second section on poetry, but it's on unseen poetry. You have to analyse 1 unseen poem for 24 marks, and then you have to do a comparison for 8 marks, but we don't need to worry about that right now. So going into a little bit more depth then about our poetry anthology. So all of these exams are closed book exams. So what that means is you are not allowed to take any copies of the play, novels or poems into the exam with you to look for quotations. So that's why we place the importance on you remembering quotations, learning the text so kind of vividly that you can recall them in the exam, because you won't have a copy of them in the exam. Okay. So as regards the Love and Poetry Anthology then, so there are 15 poems. Yes, you have to know every single one of them, okay? And they range from the 18th century all the way up to the 20th century. So those historians of you out there will know that obviously that means we're looking at texts from 1700s all the way up to the 1900s, okay? In the exam, you'll be given one poem, which is printed on the exam paper, so you will get a copy of one of the poems. And then you're expected to compare it to another poem that we've studied from the other 14, okay? So you have to choose the second poem, so you have to know how you could compare them, but you also have to remember that second poem because you won't have a copy of it in the exam. So it's really, really important when we're learning poetry that you keep going back to it and revising it. It is therefore a good idea to try and learn each poem off by heart. I don't mean that I'm going to ask you to stand in front of me and recite the poem, but I mean knowing the basic information about the poem, being able to pick out key quotations, that is what you should be able to do for each of the 15 poems. And the essay question is obviously on English Literature Paper 2, Section B, and it will come after the An Inspector Calls essay. So what I might suggest at this point would be appropriate is that you write this information down in your book so you know what the end goal is for this unit of work, okay? It is one of those units of work where if you miss a lesson, you know, it can be quite devastating and have quite a large impact on your progress, because you'll miss a whole poem if you miss a week's worth of work. So I am kind of pleading with you all that we commit to starting our GCSEs in the right way, and we commit to trying our best to learn this content, okay? So this needs copying in your books, please. Okay then, again, we're just going to have a brief kind of look at then what an essay would include for this question, okay? Again, I'm going to suggest that you copy this down into your books because it's all important information that you need to know and you need to be able to tell me about in our next lesson. So first of all, when we're studying poetry, we write a paragraph on each of the following. So the first one is language in the poem. So we think about language features such as metaphors, similes, personification, imagery, semantic fields, verbs, adjectives, and we put that into a PCOR paragraph, okay? Now obviously I'm aware that you've not written full PCORs a lot for me. We did start having a look at them for obviously Curly's wife in Of Mice and Men. So this is really going to kind of develop those skills for you. Don't worry about language features so much at the moment. We will do a bit of revision work on them before we start having a look at the poems, so you know what they are, and obviously we can successfully get you onto that exam system. We then have a think about the form of the poem and the structure of the poem. So this kind of feeds into one paragraph. So the form of the poem is to do with its rhyme, rhythm, and the syllables and the effects of these. The structure is about how the poem progresses, what is being said at the beginning, middle, and end of the poem, okay? And the reason, obviously, we put those two together is because they're to do with how the poem has been written rather than what is written, okay? And again, there's lots of different ways that we can work those things out, so we will have a look at those together. So we do this for every single poem that you study. So the pages in your books tend to look pretty similar, but that's obviously because we want you to practice the skills that are needed to be successful in this exam. So what you're going to do now for the rest of the lesson is have a read through the model that's on the next slide to see how this would look in an exam. So obviously you should have copied this down into your books for me. Once you've had a read through the model, there are excuse me. Excuse me. There is, excuse me. There are some show my homework questions for you to have a go at to check what you've understood from this. I'm really looking forward to obviously seeing you back in class, and I'm hopeful that obviously we can have a nice positive start to your next GCSE unit. If anyone's got any questions or concerns about obviously English literature or about the content that we're covering, please do just drop me an email, and obviously we can talk about it in a little bit more depth.